Hello YouTube. Today I want to explore a notion that is somewhat popular in philosophy and perhaps in the sciences as well, and that's the idea of levels of reality. Um, so I should say I have a minor cold, so just bear with me on that one if I'm coughing and spluttering a bit through this video. But anyway, the basic thought here is that reality is structured into a hierarchy of levels, and we have sort of higher level entities and lower level entities, where higher level entities in some sense emerge from the lower level ones. On the lowest level that we know of, we have the elementary particles, quarks, electrons, muons, neutrinos, bosons, photons, and so on. Perhaps that's not the lowest level. Many physicists think that there's actually a lower level of strings, but the quarks and electrons and so on, that's the lowest level that we understand well. At a higher level, there are atoms and molecules, and then if you go higher still, there are cells and proteins and so on, and then higher still are organisms, and then species, and then ecosystems, and I don't know, maybe something beyond that. But that's the basic picture. It's a fairly intuitive one, I think. Now, the concept of levels plays an important role in philosophy. Many philosophical problems can be understood as really being about the question of what is the relation between two different levels. For instance, in the philosophy of mind, if we are materialists, we will presumably take it that minds arise out of processes going on in the brain and perhaps the wider body. Mental states are at a higher level than neural states. And the big question is, what is the relation between minds and brains? What is the relation between these higher level psychological properties and the lower level neural biological properties? So today we're going to ask, how should the notion of levels be explicated? What is it that makes one entity a denizen of a higher level than another? And I'm just going to briefly look through some different options and explain some of the basic problems that they face. So first thought is that levels are distinguished by the sizes of the things that exist in them, with higher levels containing larger things. Elementary particles are very, very small, molecules are larger, cells are larger again, and so on. Now this view faces a number of problems. First of all, presumably the fundamental forces would all count as lower level properties, but gravity occurs over a very great range. The force of gravity shapes whole clusters of galaxies. And you can contrast this with something like the strong nuclear force, which is the force that binds protons and neutrons together into atomic nuclei. This operates over the range of less than an atom. So here we have two forces that are fundamental, so these would seem to be lower level things, and yet there's a very great divergence in the size of them, or in the sort of range over which they operate. But then, that there are responses here. For one thing, forces are transmitted by particles. So the electromagnetic force is carried by photons, and it's somewhat speculative at this point, but perhaps gravity is carried by fundamental particles called gravitons. The defender of this view might say, well, actually we can situate gravity comfortably at the lower level, because even though in a sense it occurs over a very great range, the force is actually carried by very, very, very small particles. I think that that's not a very plausible response for a couple of reasons. First of all, because, as I said, gravitons are still a speculative idea. I think that in metaphysics and so on, we really should be appealing to current science. We can't make assumptions about open scientific questions based on what might best accord with one's philosophical views. If it turns out that gravitons exist, that's fine, but maybe it won't. Maybe science will go in some other theory, in which case the levels picture would not be vindicated. But second, even if there are gravitons, arguably gravitons should be understood as simply being at a lower level than gravity. Gravitons would explain how the force of gravity is realised. You still have gravity as a force that occurs over a great range, and this would still be at a fairly low level, if not the lowest. It remains the case that gravity operates on me. I'm a relatively small thing in the scheme of the universe, and it also operates on entire clusters or superclusters of galaxies. So, arguably, there's still a problem there, even if there are gravitons. Furthermore, as another example of some of the difficulties with size, some structures that can be seen with the naked eye are whole molecules. I believe that pure diamond, for instance, consists of billions of covalently bonded carbon atoms, so it would, in some sense, I think it arguably count as a whole molecule. Similarly, a salt crystal is simply a repeating pattern of sodium and chlorine in an ionic lattice. I'm not sure that would count as a whole molecule. I'm not an expert on chemistry. But at rather smaller scales, DNA strands are considered single molecules, and they're sometimes many inches long, although they're tightly coiled up. But there's an example of where the chemical level of molecules sort of bleeds into the biological level. The second and more serious problem with size is that size just doesn't seem to be applicable to all levels. Consider electrons. Traditionally, we think of electrons as being like tiny billiard balls, or perhaps like tiny planets orbiting the atomic nucleus. That's actually just wrong. In fact, electrons don't have specific sizes. They are rather more like clouds of probabilities. Where the cloud is densest, the probability of detecting the electron there is higher. Where the cloud is less dense, the probability of detecting the electron is lower. But there isn't any fact of the matter where the electron really is, as it were. It exists as a kind of smudge extending over an indefinite range. In this image of a hydrogen atom, we have the nucleus here, this little pinkish dot, and then this whole sort of black cloud is the electron. That's what, it's this kind of smudge. It's a cloud of probability. Similar problems with size arise in other cases. What is the size of a species? Is a species the same size as its constituent organisms taken as an aggregate? Well, if so, then consider a species on the edge of extinction containing just one member. In that case, the species and the organism, which are two apparently distinct levels, actually have the same size. On the other hand, if we reject this approach, if we reject the idea that a species is simply the size of its constituent organisms, how is the size of a species determined? It would seem that on this view, species just don't really have any particular size. Size isn't applicable to species. For a more everyday example, take weight. Weight is a relational property defined as the force on an object due to gravity. What is the size of an object's weight? That question just doesn't seem to make much sense. Weight is not the sort of thing to which size is applicable. So we can't distinguish levels by sizes if some entities or properties can't be said to have sizes. The second approach is complexity. As we move up levels, entities and properties become increasingly complex. Molecules are more complex than atoms, cells more complex than molecules, societies are more complex than cells. Now this view faces, again, some rather obvious problems. First of all, we would need to provide a clear definition of complexity. There are measures of complexity, but how we would apply these universally across the board is questionable. But even if there is a universal complexity measure, it looks like it's just not going to be able to do the job. So consider water. Many of the apparently higher level properties of water are actually quite simple. The surface tension, which causes it to assume the least surface area, or its viscosity, which is a measure of its resistance to flow. Those are perfectly simple properties. They're very straightforward, simple properties. Surface tension and viscosity. Nothing complex there. But on the lower level, these properties are realised by extremely complex interactions. There are billions of H2O molecules all constantly forming and breaking hydrogen bonds, plus there are dispersion forces, which are weaker attractive forces caused when the movements of an electron in a molecule induce a temporary dipole. There's all these things going on the molecular level, very, very, very complex interactions, which realise these simple higher level properties. So in that case, the lower level looks more complex than the higher level. Similarly, consider mental states such as beliefs, desires, emotions, pains. Compare that with the incredible complexity of all of the neural connections in the nervous system. So far from higher levels being more complex, often when we move up a level, we gain enormously in simplicity. Now, one response to this is to say, well, a higher level is attained when lower level phenomena become sufficiently complex that it's more useful to treat them as a whole, to look at them as sort of being one thing rather than treating them as an aggregate. So you can kind of treat water. When we interact with water on the higher level, we don't treat it as something made of billions of little molecules. We just sort of treat it as a continuous fluid, and that's so we might suggest, look, that's because the lower level phenomena have become sufficiently complex that it's just more useful to treat it as a whole thing rather than as a kind of aggregate. So levels are defined by complexity, but the complexity that matters is on the lower level. The problem with this view is that it looks to me like this just means that levels become a matter of what we can understand. They are epistemologically important, but they don't have any kind of metaphysical existence. There are not really any levels of reality. Levels are just kind of useful pragmatic fictions. It's easier for us to understand water, or to sort of see water as being a continuous fluid rather than as being composed of billions of little molecules. But that's just a sort of fact about us. It's not a fact about reality in any sense. We'll return to this point a bit later. A third option is composition. We might suggest that higher level entities are in some sense composed of lower level entities. Molecules are composed of atoms. Cells are composed of molecules. Organisms are composed of cells. Now, if we're going to treat levels as being defined by composition relations, the obvious question is, what kind of composition is required? Presumably, not just any composition will do. A computer is composed of the screen, keyboard, the mouse pad, and so on, but we wouldn't consider a computer to be a higher level entity than a screen or a keyboard. Of course, some people might try to bite the bullet here and say that actually the computer is a higher level entity than the screen. So that if entity A is composed of entities B, C, D, etc., then A is a higher level entity than B, C, D, etc. I would say that view just trivializes talk of levels. We might as well just drop the concept of levels and talk simply of composition in that case. If any kind of composition creates a new level, then what's this concept of levels even doing? Just talk about composition. That's a much more simple concept, and that's all you would really be talking about there. So perhaps we could suggest that levels are characterized by types of things. Certain types of things are composed by certain types of other things. Biological things are composed of chemical things. But it's difficult to see how to make that precise in a sort of non-question begging way. After all, there can be different types of things on the same level, like the different types of chemical elements. The most serious difficulty with this approach is that composition relations between different types of things are often vague and context dependent. Consider, for example, what is a gene composed of? Genes were postulated to explain patterns of inheritance of phenotypic traits, and these days they're often identified with sequences of DNA that encode proteins. However, complications on the path from DNA to RNA to protein make the sort of straightforward identification of genes with DNA sequences quite difficult. So DNA sequences contain coding sequences known as exons and non-coding sequences known as introns. After the transcription into RNA, introns are removed from the RNA transcript and the exons are spliced together. But this isn't a rigid process. Through mechanisms known as alternative splicing, exons can be removed, and different exons can be removed in different ways. So one DNA sequence can give rise to various RNA transcripts. As you can see in this diagram, you can splice exons together in different ways. For the Drosophila D-scam gene, alternative splicing can produce 38,016 different RNAs, which allows the same DNA sequence to play various different roles in different tissues. That's discussed in the article Alternative Splicing of the Drosophila D-scam pre-mRNA is both temporally and spatially regulated by Calotto and Gravely. Another intriguing process is DNA methylation, in which methyl groups can be added to DNA nucleotides, usually repressing gene expression. So a methylated DNA sequence will play a very different role in the genome from an unmethylated sequence. Now, it's important to note that these are not just accidental processes, as it were. Processes like this are absolutely essential for the proper expression of DNA. Patterns of DNA methylation are heritable from parent to child, and without it the organism simply wouldn't be able to grow properly. Alternative splicing is an essential component in the operation of the immune system, for instance. It's one of the things that allows the immune system to produce potentially millions of different kinds of antibodies and so tailor itself to specific infections. You can check out Nessa Carey's book, The Epigenetics Revolution, if you're interested in this topic. The point for us is this. When we talk about genes as higher level entities, we're generally referring to those Mendelian entities that explain patterns of inheritance of phenotypic traits. These are the entities we're thinking about when we draw Punnett squares like this. Here, we're interested in the probabilities of the inheritance of certain traits from parents to offspring, and we look at the sort of laws that govern that inheritance and so on. But genes, in this sense, may be best conceived not simply as composed out of DNA sequences, but as being composed of DNA sequences plus various other processes involved in the expression of the DNA, which is, of course, dependent on various other processes going on in the cell. On this view, there is no single answer as to sort of what composes a gene. It's context dependent. In different circumstances, genes may be composed of different things. So there may be some problems appealing to composition. A fourth view is that levels are distinguished by causal relations. William Wimsatt, in his book Re-engineering Philosophy for Limited Beings, suggests that we can distinguish levels because entities of different levels interact primarily with one another. We can draw causal relations between various entities, and where causal chains are dense, we have a level. So, one problem with this is that causality, like composition, is often, it's context dependent. It's often a matter of perspective. We assume that humans normally interact with other humans and not with human cells because we easily see humans, whereas we can't normally see cells. If we saw cells as easily as we saw humans, we would probably see all kinds of causal interactions between sort of the human as an organism and the cell. We'd see sort of a human organism causally interact with the cells of another human or with another organism. as another example, suppose an asteroid impact occurs. Well, what entities does the asteroid interact with? Does it interact with cells or individual organisms or with whole species? Does it interact with individual trees or with the whole forest? I mean, there's simply no way to tell without first assuming the levels picture. I suppose prima facie we would say that it interacts with entities on all levels. It interacts with molecules, with organisms, with species, and so on. But you wouldn't want to say that the asteroid exists on all levels. What would we say, that there's some like a different asteroid for each level, or that doesn't seem to make so much sense. So a different form of the causal view is proposed by Craver and Bechtel in their article Top-Down Causation Without Top-Down Causes. Unlike Wimsatt, Craver and Bechtel see levels not as large-scale structures of reality, but as arising only in the context of mechanisms. So they say an item X is at a lower level than an item S if and only if X is a component in the mechanism for some activity psi of S. They define mechanism as follows. They say mechanisms are entities and activities organised such that they exhibit a phenomenon. As an example, consider the eye. The eye transduces light into a pattern of neural activity. That's the highest level understanding of what the eye does. Now we can decompose this process into various lower level activities. Light enters the eye, where it is focused by the lens onto the retina, where it is converted into a pattern of activity in the optic nerve. Here we have entities and activities organised so that they exhibit the phenomenon of the transduction of light into a pattern of neural activity. And we can decompose this further. Focusing on the retina, we can go to a lower level to explain its functioning. We can consider the activation of rods and cones in the retina, how there are different types of cones which enables colour vision, and how these send signals to ganglion cells and so on. So the higher level phenomenon of activation of the retina is explained by appealing to lower level rods, cones, and ganglion cells. And of course we can move to a lower level still to explain the functioning of those cells. Now interlevel causality would amount to causation between parts or components and wholes of mechanisms. It would be causation between a part of a mechanism and the mechanism itself, which Craver and Bechtel take to be impossible. The cones are a component of the mechanism of activity in the retina. So it seems to make no sense to say that cones cause activity in the retina. The cones are part of that activity. They're part of what that activity consists in. So we can distinguish levels by tracking causal relations. Ebola causes Frank's death. So the Ebola virus and Frank occupy the same level. That's perhaps a surprising consequence. We would usually think of viruses as lower level entities than people. But remember that we're not at this point trying to distinguish levels by appealing to size. And the point is causal relations. And small things can be causally related to big things. Note that this is quite a limited view of levels. On this view, levels arise only in particular contexts. We can't organise all entities into a clear hierarchy of levels. We find levels where we have some complex phenomenon that can be analysed into parts. The phenomenon is on the higher level, the parts are on the lower level, and those parts might be analysed into further parts that are on lower levels still. However, there are problems even with this limited view. So we've just seen that Ebola causes Frank's death, so Ebola and Frank must occupy the same level. But now suppose we wish to know why Frank is maintaining a fever of, say, 39 degrees centigrade. Well, in this case, it looks more like the virus should be treated as part of the mechanism producing the effect. It certainly seems to count per Craver and Bechtel's definition of mechanism. Remember, they say that mechanisms are entities and activities organised such that they exhibit a phenomenon. The virus is among the entities and activities organised such that they maintain Frank's body temperature above the norm. The virus combined with various molecular processes occurring in Frank's body, is what realises the phenomenon of his higher body temperature. So now it appears that the virus is on a lower level in Frank. And given the question of Frank's high body temperature, the Ebola virus must be treated as being on a lower level than Frank. But given the question of Frank's death, the Ebola virus must be treated as being on the same level as Frank. So, I mean, what one response here is that, okay, the Ebola virus isn't part of the mechanism producing Frank's high temperature. Perhaps we could say that the mechanism here just involves processes of Frank's own body cells, that end up creating the fever, and the virus is the cause of one of the causes of the fever, rather than a component of any mechanism producing it. But I mean, that's sort of my point, right? It seems perfectly legitimate to treat it either way. The virus. It doesn't really seem to make much difference whether we treat the virus as a component of the mechanism producing the fever or as a cause of the fever. That just seems to sort of depend on our perspective. And these kinds of cases are quite easy to proliferate. Is the gut microbiota part of the mechanism of digestion, or is it merely something that has a causal influence on digestion? It seems to me that this is it doesn't really matter what we say here. Both views are equally legitimate. Without the gut microbiota, we wouldn't be able to digest food, or at least we wouldn't be able to digest it nearly as well. Whether it's part of the mechanism that realizes the phenomenon of digestion, or whether it's a causal influence on that mechanism, what difference does this make? So the point is, there are various cases where the distinction between constitution and causality really just seems to be up to us, and so we can't then appeal to causal relations as defining levels of reality, metaphysically. So those are a few ways we might try to define levels of reality, and as we've seen, they have some problems. I've been quite brief with each of them, so there are various ways we can make them more sophisticated, but that's something to think about. I should note that as a fifth option, we might try some combination of these previous four options. Perhaps levels of reality are determined by size, complexity, composition, causality, and maybe other features, and different features apply to varying degrees in different levels. That's certainly a possible view. Although I think it would probably take quite a lot of effort to make it precise and to develop it in a way that avoids the problems with each feature considered on its own. So, I'm not going to talk about that too much here, but that's an option. Now, I should also note that anybody who holds that there are levels of reality will need to explain why this view is to be preferred to, let's say, a deflationary account, according to which levels are simply constructed by us. Levels are epistemological. They are we group certain phenomena together because we find it useful to do so. As a purely pragmatic matter, we can't treat everything as simply being fermions and bosons. That would be far too complex. So we understand the world in terms of various so-called higher level entities. But metaphysically, there is nothing beyond the fundamental level. Ultimately, there are no higher level entities. There are just fermions and bosons, or perhaps strings, whatever physics ultimately decides is the fundamental level. And everything else beyond that is constructed by us. It's a sort of useful tool for us. So the kind of reductionist view, the sort of hardcore reductionism, which holds that there's nothing but fermions and bosons. Why should we prefer the levels picture to that hardcore reductionist picture? Before we end, let me note an important argument against the notion of levels of reality. This is Jaegwon Kim's exclusion argument. Suppose we have some higher level properties or entities M emerging from lower level properties or entities P. M might be mental states and P might be brain states. if we're going to say that M and P are literally different things that occupy different levels of reality, it looks like we need to say two things. First, we have to say that M is supervenient on P. To say that M is supervenient on P is to say that you can't change M without changing P. So if mental states are supervenient on brain states, this means that any difference in mental states entails a difference in brain states. This seems reasonable enough, and that's true of all higher level entities. The point is that higher level entities don't simply float free, as it were, of lower level ones. In some sense, the entities of the higher level must be dependent on the entities of the lower level. The minds are dependent on neural states, or perhaps states of the brain and the body. But the point is there are sort of physical states that minds are dependent on, and that's the point of requiring supervenience. Second, we need to claim that M is distinct from P, or irreducible to P. So in some sense, mental states are more than just brain states. If mental states are just brain states, then of course we don't really have two separate things here. We don't have two levels. We just have brain states. And presumably brain states themselves would ultimately be eliminated in favour of fundamental particles. In order to sustain the notion of levels, we have to give some sense to the idea that M, although it's dependent on P, doesn't end up just reducing to P. That M has to be something more than just P. So the levels picture requires supervenience and distinctness. But Kim points out that there's a problem with this view. Suppose some higher level event M1 causes another high level event M2. So M1 might be the belief that I have won a prize, and M2 might be the feeling of pride. That's a perfectly standard causal claim about mental states. The belief that you have been successful at some difficult endeavour causes the feeling of pride. So let's diagram what's going on here. We have M1 causing M2. Of course, M1 and M2 are each dependent on brain states, so we also have P1 and P2, presumably P1 causing P2. This is the intuitive picture. The red arrows represent causation and the blue arrows represent the supervenience relation. But this picture doesn't really make much sense because the higher level properties are dependent on the lower level properties. So you bring about M2 by bringing about P2. Right? That's you don't just get M2, as it were. The way to bring about M2 is to bring about the lower level properties that realise it. So we're driven to a picture like this, where M1 is the cause of P2, and so it exhibits downward causation. Now there are some obvious problems with this picture. First of all, M1 itself arises from the physical properties P1. Since P1 determines M1, I mean, surely the real cause of P2 is going to be P1. P1 is what's doing the real work here. More seriously, saying that to say that the physical properties are not say that these physical properties are not caused by other physical properties doesn't really seem to be compatible with modern physics. A basic assumption of modern physics is that if any state of physical particles has a cause, then that cause must be a prior state of physical particles. So it looks like the physical properties P1 preempt M1 as a cause of P2, giving us this picture. On this view, the higher level properties are mere epiphenomena. They have no causal powers. And that raises the obvious question. If higher level entities are mere epiphenomena, what's the point of postulating them at all? If M1 has no causal powers above and beyond P1, why would we think that M1 is something separate from P1? This just seems like a completely unnecessary expansion of our ontology. Occam's razor tells us not to postulate entities without necessity. So what's the point of of this kind of picture? Why not just kind of cut away M1 and M2 and just have this sort of extreme reductionist view that there's nothing but the physical particles? So perhaps we could suggest that P2 is overdetermined. It's caused by both P1 and M1. Now, overdetermination does seem to occur in some circumstances. Let's say that both Frank and Vincent shoot John, and both bullets reach John's head at exactly the same time. And then it looks like John's death is overdetermined. It was caused by both Frank and Vincent. If Frank hadn't been there, John would have died from Vincent's bullet at exactly the same time, and if Vincent hadn't been there, John would have died from Frank's bullet at exactly the same time. But this is a special case. If we use overdetermination to save the levels picture, then it looks like we have to assume that overdetermination always happens. It seems rather ad hoc. In any case, there's a deeper problem with overdetermination in this context. We can't say that if P1 hadn't been there, P2 would still have been caused by M1. Because if P1 hadn't been there, M1 wouldn't have been there either. Or at least, M1 could have been there, but only by substituting some very specific physical entities and properties for P1. It takes a very specific kind of brain state to realise the belief that I have won a prize. The point is that in the shooting case, merely removing Frank will mean that John still dies, because John will die by Vincent's bullet. Similarly, merely removing Vincent will mean that John still dies. He'll die by Frank's bullet. But if you merely remove P1, if that's the only change you make, then in doing so you also remove M1, and there's nothing left to cause P2. So there just doesn't seem to be any reason for supposing that P2 is overdetermined. It looks like P1 is doing all of the work. So that's levels of reality. The notion of levels of reality is, I think it's an intuitively attractive picture. What I hope to have shown in this video is just that it might take some work to make this intuitively attractive picture philosophically respectable. There are clearly a variety of ways of spelling out the notion of levels, and however we spell it out, it looks like we're going to face some sort of exclusion problem, so we would need to answer that. So that's all I wanted to talk about today. Thanks for watching.